The Natalie Wood mystery, solve at last? What we're about to walk through will make you question everything you thought you knew about that night off Catalina Island. For 40 years, the story was simple, neat, and tragic. A beloved movie star slipped from a yacht and drowned. But it turns out that neatness was an illusion. When you pull at one thread, bruises on an arm, a delayed call for help, a captain who changed his story, the whole fabric unravels. Tonight, we'll examine 6 critical pieces of evidence that together rewrite the accepted version of Natalie Wood's death. Each alone raises questions. Together, they form a pattern investigators could no longer ignore. This isn't sensationalism. These are the facts as they were later re-examined. Physical findings, contradictory testimonies, a reopened investigation, and a family that never stopped asking why. By the end, you'll see why authorities changed the cause of death and why one man was named a person of interest. And you'll understand why Natalie Wood's death may have been far darker than the phrase tragic accident allows. Element 1. The body didn't fit the story. The morning of November 29, 1981, Natalie Wood's body was found floating about a mile from the yacht Splendour. She wore only a nightgown and a down jacket. On the surface, that might look like someone who'd stepped out in a hurry and slipped. But the autopsy and later forensic reviews tell a more complicated story. There were multiple fresh bruises on her arms, wrists, legs, and face, patterns inconsistent with the kinds of scrapes and impacts you'd expect from a single fall into the sea. Some bruises looked like grab marks. Her forearms bore scratches that resembled defensive wounds. The marks people make when they raise their arms to shield themselves. Several fingernails were broken in a way that suggested frantic grasping. Forensic experts who revisited the file decades later noted these injuries didn't read like an accidental tumble. The ocean didn't leave those bruises, one pathologist observed. Someone else did. Timing deepened the mystery. Physiological indicators suggested Natalie had been in the water for hours before being discovered, a window during which no one aboard testified to having raised an alarm. And while she had alcohol in her system, the level was not so high that it would explain bizarre, risky behavior. Natalie famously feared deep water. She had nearly drowned as a child on set. That fear makes a spontaneous, voluntary departure at night into a small dinghy hard to square with the facts. Taken together, defensive scratches, possible restraint marks, broken nails, and an extended time in the water, these findings shifted the autopsy from a single, tidy explanation to a far more troubling set of possibilities. Element 2, the husband's story kept changing. Robert Wagner's account of that evening changed in the years after Natalie's death. His initial statements described a quiet, uneventful night. He said he was below deck, watching television, and only discovered his wife missing when he went to the stateroom around midnight. He claimed he assumed she had taken the dinghy ashore, a story that seems at odds with Natalie's fear of water and her reluctance to operate a small boat alone, especially at night. Over the next months and years, Wagner's narrative evolved. He later acknowledged tension aboard the Splendour and described arguments with actor Christopher Walken and eventually with Natalie herself. By the mid-1980s and then again in later interviews and his memoir, Wagner admitted the evening included heated exchanges, details that were absent from his earliest statements. Why does this matter? Because each revision made the night look less like a random tragedy and more like a night of conflict. Investigators noted that as contradictory evidence emerged, Wagner's story shifted to accommodate it, a pattern law enforcement often watches for when people try to distance themselves from responsibility. Compounding concerns, Wagner initially cooperated with investigators but later declined to speak when the case was reopened decades later. In 2018, after renewed investigation, authorities officially named him a person of interest. That designation does not equal guilt, but it signals that investigators believe he has information critical to the case. Element 3. The quiet man, Christopher Walken. Christopher Walken was a guest on the Splendour that weekend. He was Natalie's co-star, and his presence looms over the story because he was reportedly one of the last people to see her alive. Yet for decades, Walken offered remarkably little about what he did or heard that night. He gave a short, tightly worded statement initially, saying he went to bed early and didn't witness anything unusual, and then largely declined further comment over the years. Silence can have many explanations. One theory is legal advice. After a suspicious death, attorneys sometimes counsel clients to say as little as possible. Another theory points to fear. The boat's captain later claimed to have seen Wagner in an extreme state of anger that night, and Walken might have been cautious. A more charitable interpretation suggests Walken wished to protect Natalie's privacy and family. Whatever his motive, Walken's reticence made him an enigmatic and crucial figure. If he was present during the argument that witnesses later described, his perspective could clarify whether the conflict escalated beyond words. The fact that he retained counsel soon after the death, an unusual step for someone claiming no knowledge of suspicious circumstances, only intensified speculation. He did cooperate with investigators years later, but those conversations have remained private, and he has continued to decline public interviews that could illuminate his role in that night's events. Element 4. The captain recanted and pointed fingers. Dennis Davern, the Splendor's captain, is perhaps the single most consequential voice to reverse course. For nearly 30 years, he publicly supported the accidental drowning story and even defended Wagner, his employer. But in the late 2000s, Davern published a book and began to tell a different tale. Davern's revised account describes escalating jealousy and rage from Wagner that evening. He claimed to have heard a shouting match that moved from the salon to the deck, then a sudden and unnatural silence. When he went to investigate, Davern said he found Wagner alone and was told that Natalie was missing. Davern later alleged Wagner instructed him not to call for help immediately, to wait and see, and to keep the story straight. Davern described Wagner as focused less on searching and more on controlling the narrative, making phone calls, managing who would be told, and curating what the official explanation would be. If true, Davern's claims explain several troubling inconsistencies. Why there was an allegedly unexplained delay of roughly 4 hours before authorities were notified, why the dinghy was found beachside in a suspicious condition, and why wounds on Natalie looked like they were sustained before she entered the water. Critics accused Davern of opportunism, that he might have revised his story for financial gain or revenge, but investigators found parts of his later testimony matched facts that had been overlooked or under-investigated in 1981. Davern's willingness to change his account cast doubt on the decades-old narrative and helped trigger a law enforcement review. Element 5. The case is reopened. The medical examiner changes the ruling. In November 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened Natalie Wood's case. That re-examination was not theater. It involved modern forensic review of the autopsy, new witness interviews, and close scrutiny of the original investigative choices. The medical examiner's reanalysis was especially consequential. Modern forensic techniques and a fresh look at the bruises led the coroner's office in January 2013 to amend Natalie's official cause of death from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. Crucially, the coroner noted that some bruises appeared to have occurred prior to Natalie entering the water, a distinction that directly contradicted the idea that she simply slipped and fell. The reopened probe also unearthed other failures. Witnesses in neighboring boats who reported hearing a woman's cries were not thoroughly followed up in 1981. The dinghy's condition and the way its oars were stowed were not properly examined. And perhaps most troubling, some forensic testing was not completed before the body was released for burial. Those lapses allowed those who questioned the original finding to argue that the first investigation was at best rushed and at worst influenced by deference to celebrity and connections. By 2018, after new witness statements and the coroner's amended findings, the Sheriff's Department publicly named Robert Wagner as a person of interest. Again, that label is not synonymous with an accusation of murder, but it marks a serious shift. A man once treated as a grieving widower was now someone authorities believed might hold answers they needed. Element 6, a sister who never stopped demanding answers. Lana Wood, Natalie's younger sister, refused to accept the simple accident story from day one. For more than 40 years, Lana pressed for answers, speaking to reporters, consulting with investigators, publishing her own recollections and claims, convinced that her sister had not accidentally drowned. Lana's persistence was not merely emotional, it was also substantive. She emphasized Natalie's well-documented fear of deep, dark water and argued it made a voluntary nighttime ride in a small dinghy implausible. She pointed to bruises, defensive wounds, and the delayed report as evidence of something more sinister. Over time, many aspects of her long-standing concerns were echoed by investigators and forensic re-examinations. The coroner's amended report, the captain's revised account, and new witness statements validated some of her insistence that the story deserved a second look. Skeptics dismissed Lana as a grieving sister clinging to conspiracy. Supporters said her relentless advocacy kept the case alive long enough for authorities to address evidence missed the first time. Whether motivated by grief, conviction, or both, Lana's voice forced the question. When power, celebrity, and institutional deference meet tragedy, will the truth be properly pursued? Bringing the pieces together, what most likely happened? No single piece of evidence produces a courtroom conviction. Time, missing records, and dead witnesses make the possibility of a criminal prosecution slimmer with every year. But what the evidence does show, compellingly enough for the coroner to change the cause of death and for investigators to name a person of interest, is that the accidental drowning narrative cannot easily account for the physical injuries, the delayed search, and the contradictory testimonies, reconstructing the most probable sequence of events. Investigators suggest the night began as a routine holiday weekend, but escalated into a bitter argument. That argument, according to multiple later accounts, became heated and may have turned physical. At some point, Natalie ended up in the water. Whether she was pushed, fell during a struggle, or left in desperation remains unclear. What is clearer is what happened afterward. A troubling period in which the search was not immediately launched and where those aboard offered inconsistent explanations. If Natalie was alive in the early hours, the delay could have cost her a rescue. If she was already unconscious, the sequence still points to a violent confrontation prior to her entering the water. Either way, the evidence indicates that her death was not simply a tragic misstep but the result, directly or indirectly, of human actions that for decades were explained away by a convenient, simple story. Why this matters now? This case matters because it tests how institutions treat the powerful. Wealth, fame, and proximity to Hollywood influence can shape investigations, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly. The initial acceptance of the accident theory, followed by rushed procedural choices and incomplete follow-up, suggests the earliest inquiry was insufficient. The later re-examination, spurred by a captain who changed his mind, a sister who never gave up, and modern forensic scrutiny, showed how a truth can reassert itself even decades later.